loops are when we have one loop inside of another loop. So we have an inner loop that is repeating a number of times through each iteration of the outer loop. Let me walk you through this code. We have two for loops here. One uses a counter of I. We're going to start with a value of 1, and we're going to continue as long as I is less than or equal to 3, and we'll increment that counter. So I is going to go from 1 to 2 to 3. Inside that loop, remember, this is the code that's being repeated through each iteration of the loop. And the code that's being repeated is another for loop. So here we have a counter named j, and j equals 7, and we're going to repeat as long as j is greater than 4, and we're going to decrement j. So we're going to decrease it by 1 each time through the loop. So j is going to go from 7 to 6 to 5. When it goes to 4, this is no longer valid, and it exits that loop. But when it exits the loop, it now comes back to the outer loop, and I gets incremented from 1 to 2. So we're going to see these iterations run 3 times for the outer loop, and within each one of those 3 times for the inner loop, and we'll get 9 lines of output. Because each time through our inner loop, we're going to output an item to our list box named LST output, and we're just going to show the value of I and j so you can watch how this would run. Let's keep track of our variables I and j. So here's my places in memory storing the value of I and j. When we first run this nested loop sequence, I becomes 1. And then it comes in and does the inner loop. I'm going to color code these a little bit for you. So our inner loop is the cyan color, and the outer loop is the yellow. And so j then is going to start with a value of 7. And when we come to the repeated block of code inside that inner loop, we're going to output I equals whatever the value of I is, in this case 1, and j equals whatever the value of j is, in this case 7. And that becomes our first line of output. I equals 1, semicolon, j equals 7. Now we're in this inner loop, and the value of j is now going to change to 6. We're decrementing, j minus minus. So our output now is going to be I equals 1 and j equals 6. And we see that happen there. Next time through the loop, j is decremented to 5. And now we get I equals 1 and j equals 5. Next time through the loop, I is decremented to 4, but 4 is not greater than 4. It's going to exit the inner loop and come back to the outer loop. And now we're going to increment I from 1 to 2. Comes back in, it's going to execute this inner loop, except for now it's going to reset j to the value of 7. This is kind of a fresh new loop here. And so j equals 7 and I equals 2, and that's going to be our output string, and we get I equals 2, j equals 7. Now the inner loop is going to execute again. It's going to decrement down to 6. And we get I equals 2 and j equals 6. Next time through, I equals 2, j equals 5. And then of course it goes to 4, and 4 is outside of the range of that j loop, our inner loop, and it's going to continue with the statement after that inner loop, which is our curly bracket, and it comes back and does the outer loop, incrementing it to 3, hits that inner loop again, and j becomes 7 again. And so we're going to get I equals 3, j equals 7. Inner loop runs again, j is 6, j is 5, and it increments those 2 lines accordingly. J becomes 4, and that is no longer a valid expression in the range. Exits the inner loop, and now it goes to the outer loop. The outer loop increments from 3 to 4, but that is outside the range of I being less than or equal to 3, and it's going to continue on with whatever code comes after our outer for loop. So the outer loop executes 3 times, the inner loop executes 3 times every time inside that outer loop, and we get 3 times 3 or 9 statements that are generated. That is how a nested loop works. Let's take a look at another example inside of Visual Studio. In this project, we're going to create a 6x6 grid of random letters. These might be used in a game or a word find search puzzle. We're going to use nested loops, though, to generate randomly these 6 different rows of 6 letters each. And when I click the Create button, it simply regenerates random letters. And I use a distribution list similar to what we'd see in Scrabble as far as the number of vowels versus consonants in particular letters. And I'll show you how I did that. In Visual Studio, I created a new project called Nested Loop 6x6 Letters. And my window has 2 controls on it. One is a label named LBL output, and in this label I set the text equal to 6 strings of A, B, C, D, E, F, and there are 2 spaces between each of the letters, and 1 space in front of A and 1 space after F. Just to get the size and what I wanted as far as the font size and how this was going to look, we're going to replace all those letters when we click the BTN Create button. So I also changed, of course, the font. So mine is 36-point bold Courier New. And I use Courier New because I want these to be equally spaced. So I'm going to use a monospaced font such as Courier New. If I used another type of font such as Arial or Calibri, each character doesn't take up the same amount of space. So an I would take up much less space than, say, a W. And we wouldn't get this nice alignment in our columns. So by using a monospaced font such as Courier New, we're going to get nice alignment. A space is the same width as a character. I also set the auto size proper to false, and I dragged my label to be the size that I wanted. So I'm getting 6 rows. And then I have a button named BTN Create. And all I did was just set the text of that button to create. And that's what we're going to code. So again, LBL output is the name of my label, BTN Create. Let's take a look at the code. Let me get rid of my properties here. I'll dock those over, and let's take a look at our code in the Create button. So all of our code is in this Create button, and I have a comment here. There's 98 tiles in Scrabble letter distribution. So we know, of course, there should be more vowels than consonants, and make sure that Z doesn't come up as often as, say, an S or a T or an R. And so I just simply looked at the distribution of letters in Scrabble tiles and used the same distribution. So I created a string called letters equals. You can see there's a whole bunch of A's, a couple B's, a couple C's, 4 D's, a bunch of E's, and so forth. And what I'm going to do is randomly pull one letter out of this string. So I'm more likely to get a vowel or get an A, say, than I am an H. And I used a message box here to verify the length of the string, that there actually were 98 characters, make sure I didn't mistype something. I'm going to use a random object, which I named rand, and we're going to clear the label first, and then we're going to build our display using nested loops. So my for loop, my outer for loop is going to take a value of row as an integer and go from 1 to 6. That's going to build the 4 or the 6 rows one at a time. And then within each of the building of the row is another for loop in which I'm going to go from columns of 1 through 6. That's going to be 6 letters in each row. And before I get to that for loop, I have a variable called rowString, which is a string type variable, equals nothing. And then each time through my inner loop with the column, I'm going to get a random letter from letters. So I'm going to take rand.next, and the range that I want to generate for the random number is going to be from 0 to the length of letters. And that will give me access from A to Z. Then I'm going to take rowString, which starts out being nothing, or null string. I'm going to add a space, and then the letters.substring, whatever that value of I is, that random letter, and I want one character at a time, and I'm going to concatenate another space. And I'm going to add all that to rowString. So each time through this loop, we're adding a space, a character, and a space. And eventually, 6 times this loop, we end up with 6 letters separated by spaces. And then all I do is add that to LBL output. And I used a ternary statement here because on rows 2 through 6, I want to add a new line character. So here's my output, LBL output.text. I'm going to concatenate to that. If the value of row is equal to 1, I'm going to add rowString. Otherwise, I'm going to add a new line character and rowString. And I could have done that obviously with an if-else format, but this ternary makes it a little bit cleaner, which is one line of code rather than a bunch of lines of code. And the result is when I run this, it's creating each row one at a time and the 6 letters of each row before it populates that into the list box. So that's an example of where we can use nested loops to accomplish a task. Here's another very similar example. I have a label named LBL table and a button named BTN show table. Let's take a look at the code for that button. And again, all my code is in that button. I have a string called next line, integers I, j, and k, and then for I equals 0 through 10, so I'm going to go from 0 to 9, is my outer loop. What I'm going to repeat inside that outer loop is next line equals nothing, and then an inner loop of for j equals 1 all the way through 10. So it's going to go from 1 to 10. And then k is simply going to equal I times 10 plus j, so I'm doing a calculation here. So when I is 0, 0 times 10 is nothing, and I'm adding j, and we're going to go from 1 to 10. The second time through, though, when I is 1, 1 times 10 is 10, plus we'll add 1, that'll be 11, and go all the way through 10 of j will be 20. So what I'm going to do is get a table from 1 to 100 with 1 through 10 on the first line, 11 through 20 on the second, 21 through 30 on the third, and so forth. In that next line, I'm going to build that string of next line, I'm going to concatenate k.toString. I'm going to pad to the left of 5 characters. And I set my font again in the table to something that was monospaced. Each character is the same number of spaces, and things line up very nicely. And then once I'm done building that line, I'm going to add it to my label. Let's watch this run. So I'm going to click the Show Table button, and there I get my 10 rows going from 1 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 through 30, all the way down to 91 to 100. You have an assignment of creating a multiplication table very similar, except you're going to take whatever the value of the row is times the column, and you're going to make that your value you want to display within each line of the table.